It's been more than 110 years since the ill-fated Titanic hit an iceberg on her maiden voyage. It was one of the most tragic maritime disasters of all time. But rarely does anyone wonder what the passengers of the ship ate and drank on that fateful day. Curious about their final meal? One of the most popular meals to eat on board the Titanic were oysters. These ones were particularly special since the Titanic cooking team had used the Russian style instead of how you would normally get oysters in the States. That meant that your seafood was now glazed with vodka, affectionately known as oysters à la Russe. These would be oysters placed on a bed of shaved or crushed ice with a vodka relish on the top, sprinkled with cracked pepper to round off an incredibly unique flavor profile that a lot of the passengers were not used to eating as a part of their typical cruises. Served with sparkling wine and black caviar, this was a pretty high-end first-class meal, and it was a part of the menu on the fateful day the Titanic sank, meaning that a lot of people's last meals may have just been oysters. On the voyage that took place on April 14, 1912, there was a focus on comforting cuisine and clear soups like Consomme Olga. This was not a soup exclusive to the Titanic, as it would be used by high-ranking officers on naval and marine ships as well. This is because this clear soup, more so than others, had some serious shelf life. You could keep it in the fridge for days and not have it spoiled. However, it definitely got its most popular association from being on the first-class menu for the Titanic. Of course, when you get linked to something as high profile as that, your notoriety is bound to skyrocket, but does it live up to the hype? Do you think soup of all things would be pretty boring for a last meal? It actually works as a pretty perfect comfort meal because of the lovely blend of savory meats and tangy vegetables. So before we get into the main courses, which started off with poached salmon with mousseline sauce, and yes, that is every bit as tasty as it sounds and twice as fancy as you are thinking, let's set the scene a little. Food back then, especially around the year 1912, when the final voyage of the Titanic went underway, was pretty inspired by one Auguste Escoffier. He was seen as a pioneer of mixing haute cuisine with French elements in ways that people had not envisioned before. Escoffier had a notably successful partnership with César Ritz and made a name for himself working as a head chef. It was there where he popularized dishes like poached salmon and the mousseline sauce to the point that they would be a regular staple on the Titanic menu, and as far as main courses go, it really is hard to go up from here. What works better than a filet mignon lili to truly feel like you are eating in the lap of luxury? The very peak of what fine dining has to offer, and the best seaside food coma you could ever imagine. A medium-rare filet mignon does wonders for any honest American, and that particular cut of steak echoes throughout the country's culinary history like a bell hit with a sledgehammer. This version of the dish builds on that and completely goes all in with the flavor, leading to an indisputable heavyweight champion as far as the main dish goes. A medium-rare filet served with pommes, Anna potatoes and garlic, thyme, roasted artichoke, and a red wine juice. What part of that does not scream first class to you? Speaking of the pinnacle of protein, roast duckling ticks that box just as well as anything else on this list or in this country, especially with the applesauce and Calvados glaze that it would be served with. The Titanic delighted in offering its passengers the height of everything, whether that was luxury, food, sights, or atmosphere, and it definitely did not fail with this. When people wanted to take a break from red flannel hash and other things that were sensational during the 1910s, they would go for some roast duckling. A Calvados sauce is just the Calvados mixed with cider and shallots in a saucepan then reduced, but the whisking in cream and butter adds this incredibly rich consistency to it. Kind of the perfect thing you would want with your meat, a creamy and dense sauce that really goes all the 9 yards. After all, if you were on the Titanic, you paid for nothing less. If somehow this hadn't filled you up, you could still look forward to lamb with mint sauce. This was a first-class menu that was meant to gain favor with people who had a bit more of a conservative and traditional taste. We have all seen and heard them before. You know, the old couple or two yelling about how all this French stuff is ruining America and how we need to go back to good old bacon, lamb, and beer. That was exactly the audience, and the chefs understood the assignment when they made it with those exact flavors. Suddenly you were smoking a lamb on the grill back in Texas during the fall as soon as you took your first bite of this grand flavor roller coaster. If you could know what your last drink was or pick it, what would you pick? For the Titanic passengers, it was one drink for everybody on board, the punch romaine. Also known as the infamous Titanic punch, this was branded as a palate cleanser, but it did more than cleanse the palate. It got people tipsy. This is also another one of Escoffier's imprints on the food scene across the world in general, especially America. An icy, citrus punch romaine cocktail was exactly the thing to put you in the mood for the long voyage ahead and keep you energized, buzzed, and sociable. The drink had this shimmering golden sheen to it too, which added to the first-class vibe it had going on a lot. Some people may have preferred an honest shot of whiskey with no chaser though. But as far as last drinks go, this probably was not the worst you could do. Of course, the Titanic prided itself on the inclusive experience it offered. Every taste palette was catered to, every preference arranged for, and every fantasy taken into account. That was the kind of management you needed to run something like the Titanic, which had all the PR a ship of its size could ever need. Vegetable marrow farci was their attempt at appealing to the growing number of vegetarians on the ship, which had slowly been creeping up all over America anyway. More and more people started having a problem with eating meat, especially around 1910. In fact, that is when most of these sentiments started getting truly popular. You would get some veggie marrow and mix all kinds of mushrooms, oregano, basil, and other spices to create a really strong appetizer that otherwise serves a full-course meal if you go large enough. If you have never heard of the term squab before, let's introduce you to it. Squab refers to an immature domestic pigeon, and the range for these is between 2 to 4 weeks old. Some food writers have described the meat as tasting like dark chicken, and it is a Swedish dish that is very popular in the States. The term squab itself used to mean all dove and pigeon species, but during the time where the Titanic sailed its last, it would more so refer to young passenger pigeons. All of the pigeons would be domesticated too. Squab was the 7th course on the first class, and one of the best main dishes you could get, though you could substitute it with other game if you did not feel like eating pigeon. Did you know the Titanic itself carried around 25,000 pounds of poultry and game? As far as side dishes go, it gets pretty hard when your competition is boiled potatoes. The soft texture, the squashy sensation as you bite into it, and the various things you could do with them all because of a dash of seasonings here and there. Also, on long voyages, keeping good sources of vitamin C was the key to having a good journey across the sea. And as a result, these potatoes were usually boiled with the skin still left on. The kind of potatoes the Titanic kitchen used were bovine potatoes, which had been boiled in a beef broth. They got their name from being cooked in that too, and they would often be diced into tiny cubes if they were not being boiled whole. They certainly made for a wonderful side dish and a welcome addition to the roster. Pretty impressive lineup of main dishes, appetizers, and sides, right? You all must be looking just as forward to the RMS Titanic's selection of desserts, such as peaches with chartreuse jelly. The Titanic had 10 courses and dishes that it served on April 14th as a part of the dinner, and this was, we believe, the 7th or 8th dish on the menu. The star of this show was the chartreuse jelly, which is a French liqueur highly sought after for its classically French taste and visual appeal. This one was a looker in every sense of the world. Other desserts on the RMS included French ice cream, vanilla and chocolate eclairs, and Waldorf pudding, but most people went for the delectable and eye-catching jelly. Naturally, they got a little tipsy since it contained a fair amount of alcohol. It makes sense too, since the cabin had intended for this to be a showstopper, with cooled peaches served in this sweet syrup within the jelly, and on top of it as a garnish too. So you might be thinking that a lot of these dishes seem to involve alcohol in some kind of way or the other, and cold asparagus with vinaigrette was one of those dishes. It is said that people who were on the luxury liner for its final venture on the ocean were served this asparagus drizzled with liquid gold. They were not referring to some kind of parlor trick, but actual saffron mixed with champagne vinegar served alongside the asparagus. The hues of green and gold mixing together looked perfect, and the glasses of golden champagne they served with it really brought all of it full circle together. While the asparagus itself was the perfect side after all those heavy main dishes, it did leave a little to be desired for some passengers, though whatever it lacked it made up for with spectacle and dazzling visuals, so nobody was really complaining either. Roast sirloin beef is already a pretty timeless combination that gets a lot of traction in any decade you pull up. 1910s? National sensation? 2000s? Pride and joy of steakhouses across the country? 2020? Even the Gen Alpha kids love it on Sundays. You cannot beat it, so why not include it? That is exactly what the chefs of the Titanic did when they put this as one of those 10 dishes the first class was savoring. As far as last dishes go, there are definitely a lot less grand 10-dish long courses that have been put together for grand sales. These used pearl onions and an enhanced sauce with red wine that really made it a hearty and warm dish to eat. The perfect kind of thing to warm you up after some clear soup, assuming you still had any room left in the tank. Most people gave up halfway through the course. Something that worked great as a springtime dish was green pea soup, but it also worked particularly well as a second-class appetizer. This is another bit of culinary goodness that Auguste Escoffier left us with, and the version of the soup that was served took after one of his recipes. It appears the head chef at the time was a big fan of Auguste's cooking and decided to include as many tributes to his style and flair as he could. It is a good thing, too, since it meant the passengers got to experience some of the best that French cuisine had to offer. Back in the 1910s especially, anything that was remotely fancy had some ties to French culture, and this was just as true in the States as it was sailing on a luxury liner outside of it. We did mention that one of the 4 first-class dessert options being served to passengers was Waldorf pudding, but it was not exclusive to them, and even the second-class passengers got to enjoy this beautiful buttered pudding. Peeled, sliced apples, layers of cake and breadcrumb, and the most vanilla eye cream you can imagine meant for an out-of-the-world experience. Having some of this in your room at midnight while the Titanic sailed was a one-of-a-kind experience. One can only hope that all the love and effort poured into the cooking brought some comfort to those on board before their final moments. The Titanic was one of the White Star Line's most valuable players and profitable attractions. They spared no costs or cut any corners when it came to making sure that delicacies from all around the world were ready to be served to its patrons. Once again, we see the chef's appreciation for Escoffier-style cooking with the addition of chicken lyonnaise done specifically in the way Auguste would prepare them. He would not coat the chicken, and instead of the usual chicken broth, he used a veal sauce and sautéed the chicken. The dish was described as having a dark and savory taste, but with a calming and soft sweetness that almost lulled you into sleep. Sounds more like an instrument of hypnosis than a dish, but the world has seen stranger things happen as a result of eating some mighty fine food. The inclusion of a sauce of onions also gave this dish a twist that others did not have, and it added on to the growing interest in what inspired the menu that the passengers were already beginning to have. Some cultured people on board were able to tell that this was Escoffier's work, but most were too busy stuffing themselves silly, and who could blame them when everything looked that good and tasted even better? Now that we get to the third class, the flashiness starts to go down a notch with stuff like corned beef being a starter, but the taste and comfort does not. You can still eat any one of these and go to bed with a full stomach in case you decide to do a Titanic-style 10-course buffet for your next party or family celebration. For the passengers, though, there was definitely a bit of wow factor that was lost, seeing everyone get these fancy French delights and being served. The corned beef itself was usually paired with other dishes like chicken a la Maryland. For the third-class menu and lunch, the Titanic management decided to go with a traditional roast beef-style menu that made anybody feel like they were at a Thanksgiving designed just for them, so they even made the normal stuff look much better than it had any right to, really. Rice, or also known as steerage soup, was made of chicken stock, cream or milk, onion, and rice. What came out of this traditional combination was a porridge-like soup with cream and mace that excelled at warming up your taste buds for the more bombastic dishes that awaited further down the line. We are not sure if everyone got to enjoy every part of the massive and carefully curated selection of exotic cuisine that they had planned for the Titanic, but we do know that whenever anybody ate, they were getting the best version of it. Despite being a side dish for the third class, This rice soup was no different and was much better than anything you would find in stores or restaurants, only being bested by Mom's own personal cooking. Plum pudding is, again, not anything extraordinary, and it certainly does not hold a candle to, let's say, a filet mignon lili or a Consomme Olga, but it hits the spot like none of those other fancy French dishes do too. You cannot beat your roots, and it helps to have them close by when you are in the middle of the freezing ocean. The second steward, Andrew Latimer, was probably aware of cravings like that when he was making the menu. It is a good thing he had a sensitive mind, since a lot of people definitely did ache for the things they grew up with or would always go back to during their daily lives. Peeled, sliced, mixed in with heavy, pure maple syrup and with just the right amount of brown sugar, stewed apples were the perfect thing to wrap up a menu which can only be described as divine and well-rounded. Nothing was really lacking from the menu, except the proverbial cherry on top. In this case, the cherry happened to be these freshly stewed apples, which went great with the Waldorf pudding or French ice cream that the crew was serving. These were a great way to refresh your stomach and call it a day too, since after all that savory food and boozy dessert, you would want something simple and homely right before bed. That brings us to the end of 20 specials that were offered on the Titanic's menu. Like, subscribe, and let's keep these precious memories alive.